Hello? Am I live? Why isn't it showing the time? Hold on, wait, am I live? Hold on. Maybe I'm not live. Wait, I'm confused. It's not showing. Oh, here it is. Hold on. Sorry, guys. I didn't know if I was live or not. Yeah, I'm live. Here it is. Okay, hi, guys. For some reason, my time is not saying that I'm running. But anyway, I'm on partial shadow ban. Can be hard to find my videos. If you can't find my videos, you can't ever find the first three, go to vincentbrunoshadowban.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and in the description box. Yes, the title of this is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry. However, you will find probably nothing about Judeo-Freemasonry and Christian Science in these videos. That's because, I make it, I've chosen works to read and things to present, but I have a lot of articles on Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, but there are really no books on Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry for me to read or videos to show. So, we veered off topic with that a little bit, but if you would like to see Judeo-Freemasonry and Christian Science, go to bewisestserpents.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and in the description box, and you can find that information there. Now, I am looking for ex-Christian scientists to work with for exposing Christian Science for being evil. Children are dying because of it. People are losing their mind because of it, dying in horrible ways because of it. It's not a happy religion. And also its connection to Freemasonry, but also its connection to Hinduism. I'm an ex-Hindu, and I'm helping people escape Hinduism by criticizing Vedanta, and Christian Science is very close to Vedanta. So to criticize Christian Science is to criticize Vedanta, and it's a little bit easier to criticize Christian Science. It's a little bit simpler than what you find in Hinduism, so it's a good stepping stone. But I'm also looking for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Mormons, and ex-Seventh-day Adventists with the same things about Freemasonry. If you want to find everything else about Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness, go to bewisestserpents.blogspot.com. If you want to find Seventh-day Adventists, go to butharmlessasdoves.blogspot.com. It's at the top of Be Wise as Serpents, but it's also in the description box. It is not at the bottom of the screen. So we have been we've been reading Mrs. Eddy by Edwin Dankin. It's a biography of her written in 1929. And it's very critical, very, very critical. This woman was very much adored and very much hated by a lot of people. And I'm shocked that this woman is not more known today, because in her day, she was big news, because hers was the fastest growing religion in America. And people were scared of it, because her followers were treating her like she was Jesus. And her followers were treating her like Jesus. And she was all over the newspapers. Mrs. Eddy, the mysterious Mrs. Eddy that people thought would live forever and who had all this adulation, but this always in a lawsuit, and always she was a liar, and she was insane, and she was just had this horrible personality. And then she started getting paranoid and throwing everyone out of her organization. So now we're at this point in the biography where she's dying. She's becoming a very old woman, and she's starting to not be able to get out of bed very often and stuff like that. Her empire is not quite collapsing, but she's an absentee ruler. In between that, we're listening to her book, 1875, Science and Health with Key to the Scripture. Yes. Yeah, so we are listening to those two. So let me just start. Where did we leave off? Okay, she's leaving out lots. She's writing lots of messages, people not to bother her, what her directors are supposed to do, putting in all these bylaws. She said now nobody should come to look at her in her carriage or hang outside her address to catch a glimpse of her. People would wait in the town to see her drive by, Mrs. Eddy drive by. The italics are the biographers. Mrs. Eddy, through her own publishing experience, had happened on an important and useful fact. Newspapers are not published merely because their editors and owners like to see their views in print. They're published to earn revenue. Mrs. Eddy's own publications were earning approximately $400,000 a year, including advertising receipts, before she died. It thus became wholly obvious to her that a very short and quick routine to an editor's heart would be through his pocket. And she was right. If any city editor and she was right. If any city editor ever dared ignore a communication sent out by the Committee on Publication, the managing editor would shortly receive a telephone call. He would not find the committee talking at the other end of the wire. Rather, it would be one of his most valued advertisers. The advertiser would be extremely sorry to have learned that the Unionville Beagle was so extremely prejudiced in its new columns. If the managing editor were incredulous, it would be explained that his paper seemed to have a desire to persecute and vilify the religious beliefs of the gentleman who now was speaking. If incredulity was expressed, the managing editor would be told that he should look at the bottom of column 6 on page 7 of this issue his issue last Monday week, and he would find there a news item which was wholly erroneous, unjustified, and an insult to the advertiser who was now expressing complaint. The managing editor would find a stick of type referring to Christian Science as a faith cure, would return to the wire, would try to learn what was the matter. Almost inevitably, before he had hung up, he had promised to print everything the gentleman on the other end wished to have published in correction. The result was the press was strewn with denials that Christian Science was in any way related to common faith cures, denial that Mrs. Eddy was aught but a luminous and vibrant and godly personality, assertions that her discovery was nothing else than a perfectly divine boon to man. So industrious were these various publication committees that editors very quickly came to avoid anything but the most reverent and studied approach to Christian Science, for they learned through bitter experience that the least slip would cause their telephone to begin a steady ringing that would not cease until they either had expressed public regret or had lost an advertiser. The whole secret of this influence with the press lay not in members, but in organization. Mrs. Eddy's committees were picked for shrewdness and sagacity. In most instances, they combined business acumen with religious zealotry, and they never rested until they cornered the offender editor with the most influential Eddy disciple in the community. They could pick with unerring accuracy exactly the right individual to assist the editor to revise his expression of opinion. It was natural that an editor, finding anything which he published on Christian Science subject to the most careful scrutiny, should reach the conclusion that the scientists must be a remarkably numerous and influential sect, and Mrs. Eddy's publication committee encouraged his idea whenever possible. Mrs. Eddy's own hints concerned the millions who responded to her will, combined with an editor's actual contact with her disciples, left no doubt in thousands of editorial minds that the lady had untold legions of adherents. Probably few would have believed in 1906 that there were not many more than 60,000 Christian Scientists scattered all over the country. But she was the fastest growing religion. And that from, 15 or 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, the religion started and grew to 60,000. So that's 2,000 a year. And it became 250,000 by World War II. So it was the fastest growing religion. Mrs. Eddy herself lit upon a device to encourage this delusion. In her bylaws, she asserted the following provision: Christian scientists shall not report the publication, the number of members of the mother church, nor that of the branch churches. According to the scripture, they shall turn away from personality and numbering the people. It happened when the New York ward began really to get interested in the vague gossip regarding Mrs. Eddy in 1906 that its editors had only a glimmering of the real facts, but they sensed a tremendous vital human interest story, and they were determined to get at the truth, regardless of the various wiles of the Eddy Publication Committee, if there were any possible way to arrive at it. The World's news and editorial column had always maintained an attitude of complete sang-froid toward the adjacent advertising column. It was one of the few papers of the day which would have dared to send 2 reporters up to Concord to knock boldly and persistently at Mrs. Eddy's door. For undoubtedly malicious animal magnetism, by whatever name it is known, can be as big a bugaboo in a newspaper office as in a church. The first act of the 2 reporters on arriving at Concord was to approach the 2 men who were presumably close to Mrs. Eddy, J. Wesley Plummer, who was treasurer of Mrs. Eddy's church at Concord, as well as the deputy state treasurer for New Hampshire, and Frederick N. Ladd, the secretary of Loan and Trusting Savings Bank of Concord, who was Mrs. Eddy's second cousin. She did a great deal of her business with Ladd Bank. The World Report stated that their mission to the men, quite frankly, explaining that they had heard apparently well-founded rumors that Mrs. Eddy was almost, if not quite, hors de combat, and that she was wholly under the control of other minds. Ladd and Plummer both laughed at such an idea. Isn't it enough that I tell you she is alive and well? Asked Plummer with conviction. I know it, but I fear it will be impossible to see her. She is so overwhelmed with great work. How do you know she is? He was asked. Why, I see her every day in her carriage. But how do you know the woman you see in the carriage is really Mrs. Eddy? Why, I know it. I have been told by Fry and other whom I trust with my very life. And then the fact was revealed that Plummer had never once seen Mrs. Eddy's face to face, despite the fact that he was a leader in her Concord church and lived within half a mile of her home. All he knew of Mrs. Eddy's personality was what he had heard. All he had seen of her was that he had glimpsed as she drove abroad in her carriage. The carriage had a good solid roof, and the windows were almost never lowered, and the old lady sitting in state within was always concealed almost entirely by shadow. Ladd was as certain as Plummer that Mrs. Eddy was on deck quite as usual in the state of good health, which her religion undertook to create and maintain for all its devotees. He laughed aloud and suggested that she was a pitiable invalid. Why, he said, I have conferred with her personally no longer than 6 months ago. She was a marvel of mental alertness and physical vigor. Just look at her tomorrow in her carriage, and you'll see how ridiculous these stories are. The reporters, however, refused to be convinced. They had not yet played their trump card. They announced that they had irrefutable proof that Mrs. Eddy had transferred a large part of her property to Fry and to others. They had copies of the documents of transfer. There is every reason to believe that this was entirely news to Ladd and Plummer. They were horrified. They felt that the story must be scotched immediately. They said that they would get in touch with Fry at once and arrange to have the reporters see Mrs. Eddy personally. Fry sent word that he would receive the men at noon. They drove up to the front door, which had hardly been opened since Lord Dunmore entered there, and rang the bell. The door swung open immediately, and a maid ushered them in past a large steel engraving of Daniel and Lion's Den and the reproduction of McNeil coat of arms. There they were seated in the reception room on the right, and Fry shortly made his appearance, now a short, fat, sleek man with an enormous nose, receding chin, a little mustache trimmed and twirled at the ends into deep points, and white hair brushed close to his rounded skull. Fry 2 Fry, too, was getting along in years. He wore a black suit of rather ministerial cut and white shirt with black tie and kid slippers with soles as thin as dancing pumps. He was businesslike and brusque. He inquired their purpose, although he had already been informed by Plummer and Ladd the reason of their coming. The men said they wanted to arrange for an appointment with Mrs. Eddy. Come back at 3 o'clock, said Fry pompously, and I will give you 10 minutes of my time. At 3 o'clock, the men were back again. This time they were received by Fry and Company with his assistant, Louis C. Stang, who had formerly been a dramatics critic. The world men once more repeated the reason for their arrival and explained the rumors and the information which had brought them on their quest. As Fry listened to their statement regarding rumors that Mrs. Eddy had been in the complete control for several years and their evidence that he himself held title to all her property, he slowly dropped his composed address and became flushed and angry. Well, what do you want me to do about it? He has last demanded. He was told that an interview was desired and that the world would insist on having present in this interview Mrs. Eddy's nearest neighbor, John F. Kent, in order to identify her beyond question. Kent, who for some 20 years previously had been principal of the Concord High School until he had retired from active work, had already been looked up by the reporters that had discovered that he held Mrs. Eddy in very low esteem. All courtesies between the two neighbors had been ended in the course of dispute over allocating the cost of paving a nearby road. Fry knows, Kent confided, that I looked upon Mrs. Eddy as a mountebank, that I have openly opposed her, and that I regard Pleasant View as the home of fraud and trickery. Kent therefore appeared an ideal man for exposure of the fraud, if such existed. Fry and Strang both protested at bringing such a man face to face with Mrs. Eddy. The reporters insisted. Fry told them to go back to the hotel and they would hear from him in 24 hours. Fry always masked himself in rather negative exterior and alert canniness. He was in no sense clever, but his profound loyalty to Mrs. Eddy made up for mental defects. He entered in his diary every day verbatim accounts of her reprovals of him and her angry outbursts, just as faithfully as he transcribed her words of cheer or praise. Mother was displeased with me today, he would write, and call me an idiot. I must try to do better next time. Oh no. His very fealty to Mrs. Eddy's steady and unquestioning, like that of a rather, stupid dog that has grown up in a family that made him peculiar, useful, and quick to sense danger. Fry immediately carried his report to Mrs. Eddy. Ill as she was, she herself sensed the vital need of rising to the situation. She had always at her command one important asset with which every actress is familiar, the inner glow of vitality which comes with a knowledge of duty to one's public. The oft-repeated reports that she was sick or dying were peculiarly hateful to her, and she resented them. They were indeed a public advertisement of her inability to cope with physical ill, and thus a public challenge to her claims to priestly leadership in her church. Accordingly, she announced that she would attempt to see not only the men from the world, but also her neighbor next door. Okay, let's watch the video.
This audio presentation of Science and Health and Love.
My son is Braxton, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And they said it's an extremely rare cancer.
And accepts a personal version of principle, praying God to be God, as if love was idle and omnipotence ununiformed. To call on light for light is absurd. Let there be light is the will of wisdom. and this full effulgence has nothing to do with mortal stint, but shines for all. Universal love bestows all good without respect to persons, and man receives or rejects it. But a prayer or tear changes not divine economy or eternal order. Sin shuts out light and blessing, and is the author of all tears and prayers. Wisdom helps those only who help themselves, and cannot bless evil. It destroys sin only as man gives up sin, acting in this direction only as we act. We have seen patients who would not be healed through science until they gave up the belief of mediumship and controlled their own bodies, for man is not governed in science except by his own spirit. Harmonious man is governed by the principle of being, the inharmonious by a belief of personality. Therefore, the folly to desire personal control that leads into all error. There is no truth except principle, the one God, and thou shouldst have no other. We learn in science that God and his idea are all that is immortal, but mediumship would establish the immortality of air. Science reveals progression only, but mediumship retrogression. Should a pupil continue in the primary school when fitted for a higher school? If the departed are unfit for the advanced understanding of life through which they take a spiritual place in the scale of being beyond us, why impose their ignorance on us as oracular, and think mediumship privileged to be strainer for air? That the so-called dead return to torment us, or to comfort us, or to seek aid from us, is but a belief in error. When wandering in Australia, are you seeking comfort or giving support to another dwelling in the snow caverns of the Esquimaux? Two different dreams or different awakenings separate consciousness. What is named mediumship is a phenomena of belief, without reality or science, and we ought to know the consequence of launching into new and stronger fellowship with air when we are already in it up to our necks. In an age of sin and sensuality hastening to greater development of power, 'tis fearful to consider the influence of belief without more honesty and understanding to steer clear of the fearful shoals on this dangerous and unexplored coast. The peril of Salem witchcraft even is not past until that error be met by the understanding and destroyed. Not the gallows, but explanation destroys error. Science must be allowed to explain this phenomenon of belief, in contradistinction to that of truth and intelligence controlling man. An evil and artful mind is all that Satan there is, and this is the fallen angel, or abused capacity. Such a mind, learning its control over other minds, will take the reins into its teeth, and truth alone must take them out and guide it. As of old this mind works its spell in some manner on all that would harm, because the barriers against evil influences from such a source are not understood by the world in general, and the door is not readily closed against them. To this end, metaphysics are important. Study mind more and matter less, for we must find refuge in soul, to escape the error of the latter days. And mediumship and mesmerism, more than all else, contributes to a terrible future development of discord. We should strongly insist on the majesty of truth and its control over air, and begin today denying right or reality to aught but God, and the true saying, "Depart from me, all ye that work iniquity," and thus break up the reign of error, and let the world of harmony and truth reappear. If spirit returns were possible, they would grow beautifully less at every advanced stage of existence. From the departed would pass away from our ignorance, and we away from the belief of mediumship, until the beliefs of matter were gone, and we united through science and the will of God, done on earth as it is done on heaven. The mind of soul has no fellowship or communion with the so-called mind of the body. The changing, sinful, and erring thought is not immortal spirit. Matter and brains are not mind, notwithstanding opinions and beliefs to the contrary. But we welcome the increase of knowledge, even though it never has borne the fruits of harmony and immortality, and never will approach the demonstration that Jesus gave, because knowledge must have its day, and we want that day over. The so-called mind of body is belief in error, but the mind of soul is understanding, even the science of being. Paul learned that to be present with truth, we must be absent to the body. But Cain concluded very naturally, if man gave life, he had the right to take it away, and attempted to kill his brother, showing this belief of life in matter or man was error from the beginning. We name a mistaken thought, mind, while it is error only without intelligence, but imitating it without principle, but claiming to be truth. Mistakes are impossible to understanding, and understanding is all the mind there is. Ignorance and evil are not intelligence. Soul is the only intelligence, and a creator not at the mercy of its creation. We see, hear, feel, etc., not because of eyes or ears. These faculties are symbols or expressions of understanding, which is the mind of soul. The mind of body loses them if an organ be destroyed, but they cannot perish or be marred in spirit. The senses of soul are not matter, but spirit, that apprehend and reflect intelligence and life, hence their immortality. Inspiration is the utterance of soul, giving forth its own idea or spiritual sense. It is safe to trust this communication, but it would no longer be so if matter or personal sense interpreted it. The garment in which belief, error hides itself, is that soul is in matter, holiness and unholiness, and literally God in man. Midnight foretells the dawn, and beholding a solitary star, the wise men of old were led by spiritual vision to foretell the hour of truth. But what shepherd sage today, seeing the light, is allowed to explain the darkness? The world is asleep, lulled by stupefying beliefs, in the cradle of infancy, dreaming away the hours under its spell. Entering an unknown eternity, personal sense will be found as an outlaw escaping to a foreign land, where he is doomed to an unlooked-for death. The footsteps of belief have not advanced man a single league toward immortality, and the unwillingness to learn man and God of science holds Christendom in chains. So much hypocrisy swells the catalogue of society, the honesty that demand demonstration is not desired, and incurs the enmity of mankind. Science never plays the hypocrite. To claim you understand a problem of Euclid and fail to demonstrate it would exhibit folly or dishonesty. But to solve the simple problem according to its rule proves that you perceive the principle. Science is the rule of harmonious and immortal man, Jesus the example, and Christ the principle. This rule of man is embraced in life, love, and truth, and the spiritual sense of the scripture reveals the science of being. The prophets did anciently what the worshippers of Baal failed to do, yet in some instances artifice and faith of belief feigned the work of wisdom. Necromancy and legerdemain are the inventions of man that originate in brains, or the so-called mind of matter, while science is the mind of God. One proceeds from soul and the other from sense. The beliefs of man manifest error only, but this is sometimes called a phenomena of truth that proceeds from spirits. The phenomena of principle are outside of matter and not in the least dependent on person. Mesmerism, not mediumship, are dependent wholly on belief of the so-called person of man. Mind evolves images of thoughts, and these are the apparitions seen by the so-called medium. It is not more mysterious, only because it is less common for us to see than to feel thought. To feel the grief of another's mind is not unusual, but we think to see the mind's images of departed friends is to see them in reality. Here are two equal senses, seeing and feeling, that we separate in power. There are those that feel another's pain as quickly as their own. The sick may not have touched them or spoken on the subject, and yet they feel their pain and can tell their locality, and this because of sympathy, the same as yawning is produced. Seeing belongs no less to personal sense or belief than feeling. Then why more difficult to see a thought than to feel it? Education alone determines the difference, and in reality, it is not more marvelous. Haunted houses, unusual noises, voices, apparitions, dark seances, etc., are tricks produced by tricksters, else they are images and sounds evolved by mind on this plane. The mind of soul embraces all that is real and immortal, and the so-called mind of body, which we name the mind of man, embraces all that is unreal and mortal. Truth proceeds from spirit, error from the material body. The mind of soul, spirit, is science, giving only the idea of truth. But the so-called mind of body or man is belief giving false appearances. Because there is no mind of man, that is, no material mind, thoughts said to emanate from body or mind are delusions. How may we determine the ideas of truth from belief? By learning their origin. Thoughts from the soul are ideas, and from the brain beliefs. The former proceed from spiritual sense, are not substance, and are harmonious. The latter are the product of personal sense, and are supposed substance at one time and spirit at another, and are inharmonious. The former are understanding, the latter beliefs begotten of error. To love our neighbors as ourself is an idea from soul. yea, from wisdom, love, and truth. And this idea personal sense cannot see, feel, or understand, but the spiritual sense can. The carnal mind cannot discern spiritual things. Matter is but a grosser strata of mortal mind, wherein one belief introduces and destroys another in Darwinian process. As before stated, spirit is intelligence, whereas the basis of matter is belief. The former is science, the latter mesmerism. The body that is mortal is an individualized belief that germinates, grows, and decays, dust unto dust, and mortal man is just this belief, even a phenomenon of mesmerism, an error constructing man matter. Excite the organ of veneration or the religious tone of his belief, and it manifests the most profound adoration. But change the action to an opposite development, and it blasphemes. Mesmerism is a belief constituting mortal mind. Error is all there is to it, which is the very antipode of science, the immortal mind. The former is hallucination, the latter reality, one a wholesale mistake, the other the truth of being. Mesmerism assures the sick they are recovering when there is no evidence or basis for this conclusion, turns belief whithersoever it wills, and it is the blind leading the blind. Nothing can be more antagonistic to science. It bides the truth that man is the image and likeness of God, and as such cannot be sick, sinning, or dying, and claims that mortal mind and substance matter constitute man, thus admitting through personal sense what soul denies in science. Mesmerism is a direct appeal to personal sense, proceeds from it, and derives its only prestige from belief. It is predicated on the supposition that life is in matter, and a nervatal fluid at that, whereas science reveals man's life, God, and therefore dwelling not in matter. Mesmerism is error and belief in conflict, but science masters error and belief with the understanding of truth and reveals man immortal, sinless, and undying. Mesmerism is one era of war with another, a kingdom divided against itself that cannot stand, but science is harmonious and eternal. Mesmerism is personal sense giving the lie to its own statement, denying the pains but admitting the pleasure of sense, whereas science denies all sensation to matter and holds the reins in the hands of spirit. The gulf fixed between science and mesmerism is impassable. Vitalized matter is a grave mistake. Electricity is the last boundary between personal sense and soul, and although it stands at the threshold of spirit, it cannot enter in. But the nearer matter approaches mind, the more potent it becomes. To produce supposed good or evil, the lightning is fierce, and the electric telegram swift. The more ethereal matter becomes according to accepted theories, the more powerful it is. That is, the homeopathic drugs, steam, air, and electricity, until possessing less and less materiality, it passes into essence, and is admitted mortal mind, not intelligence but belief, not truth but error. But the nearer belief approaches truth without passing the boundary, where it is no longer belief but understanding, the more plausible and dangerous is the error. Mesmerism attracts man to matter. Science attracts to principle, and therefore to spirit or God. The more material man is, the more mesmerism he possesses, but the more spiritual, the less mesmerism and the more science, and the higher his demonstration of truth. In reality, brains and matter are one, but we call them mind and matter. But if the brain be the organ of mind, and to destroy this organ destroy mortal mind, how can you distinguish between them? What we call mind and matter is mind only, but this mortal mind grows finer towards the core, and we name its exterior matter, and the interior mind, in contradistinction to the truth of being that reveals all intelligence outside of matter. The generic name of matter is mind. Its different species are the beliefs that say intelligence, life, sensation, substance, good and evil are matter, and the body called man. Also that spirit and matter commingle and form mortal man on the foundation of sickness, sin, and death. This theory is not the truth of being, but its opposite, error. Life is not organization, and intelligence takes no cognizance of matter. These are God, spirit, and to spirit there is only principle and idea. The so-called man of matter, together with every material belief of a material world, must pass away before sorrow, sickness, sin, and death can disappear. The millennium, glory, cometh only as science reveals intelligence and life outside of matter. Alas, that man should take a material sword to slay error when the two-edged sword of truth destroys it so much more effectually. The history of the Chinese Empire derives its antiquity and renown from the truer idea the Buddhist entertained of God, contrasted with the tyranny, intolerance, and bloodshed based on the belief that truth, life, and love are in matter, and the great Jehovah formed after error's pattern of mortal man or intelligent matter. To suppose matter and spirit mingle is the error that hides science on which to base our conclusion of God and man, of soul and body, and our proof of immortality. At one time we define law, intelligence, and again matter, over which intelligence holds no control, as in sickness, sin, and death. The law of spirit is the only law, and this is truth, destroying the so-called laws of nature, and its idea is walking the wave, destroying air, healing the sick, and raising the dead. This is soul triumphing over personal sense, putting to fight belief, walking over sin and matter conditions. Jesus taught and proved this truth the prerogative of spirit, and left his example for us, saying, "The works that I do, ye shall do." Paul was not one of his disciples or contemporaries, and yet he tested these teachings and demonstrated their principle. To conclude, man and the universe are governed in general by material law, but occasionally that spirit walks over this law and holds the control in its own hand, is to divide the capacity of omnipotence and wisdom with matter, and to give the latter the more general claim. These are the false conclusions of belief. Understanding rebels at such folly, mortal belief produces and governs all that sins, suffers, and dies. There is but one law, and but one lawgiver. The former is science, the latter God, soul, and the only life, substance, intelligence of man in the universe, and not in the least dependent on matter conditions, or acting by reason of them, but destroying them all. This truth knocks at the door of history. It is for us to say whether we will open and receive it. Materia medica, hygiene, physiology, creeds, and ritualism will lose their power for good or evil when man loses his belief in them and makes life its own proof of harmony in God. That which is right is immortal, and the opposite of right is mortal. When truth lays its hand on error to wipe it out, all will be growing immortal. But before the final doom of error, there will be interruptions in what we call the order of nature, and earth will become dreary and desolate. Not that summer and winter, seed time and harvest shall utterly cease before the final spiritualization of all things, but their order will be interrupted owing to the change in belief. The next step in progress is to learn how mind controls matter and how to destroy error. The science of being emancipates man from belief, giving him understanding, through which his harmony and immortality are obtained. There is neither mortal mind nor substance matter. Mind is the emanation and atmosphere of principle, and not person. It proceeds from God and not man, from spirit and not matter, from soul and not sense. Therefore, mind is not immortality, and man has not a separate mind from deity, for that would make other intelligences, and there would be more than one God. When truth is admitted, and thinking brains and intelligent bodies are found a myth, then will the harmony and immortality of man and the universe appear. When we learn matter has neither intelligence, substance, nor life, and neither suffers nor enjoys, disease will be found a belief only and healed by destroying this belief. And giving man the understanding of himself, personal sense contradicts the science of being, and so do dreams contradict the daily experience of sense. Personal sense and science are opposites that dispute each other. In dreams you fly or meet a far-off friend, and hold your body with your mind, carrying it through the air or over the ocean. And this dream of sleep is nearer man's being in science than the waking dream of life and matter, because personal sense governs it less. The era of science comes in on this statement and its proof, vis-a-vis that all is mind, and there is no matter. Sickness, sin, and death are creations of mortal mind that life and death destroy. Order and beauty emanate from the mind of soul that is immortal, and the scientific statement that all is mind will gain its first proof in healing the sick on this principle. A single demonstration of this is important evidence. A lady having an internal tumor and greatly fearing a surgical operation called on us. We conducted her case according to the science here stated, never touched her person or used a drug or an instrument, and the tumor was wholly removed within 1 or 2 days. We refer to this case to prove the principle. We have stated all is mind, But the distinction between what we call substance and essence is made by naming one matter and the other mind. Christ's understanding that soul and body are intelligence and its idea destroyed the belief that matter is something to be feared, and that sickness and death are superior to harmony and life. His kingdom was not of this world. He understood himself, soul and not body. Therefore, he triumphed over the flesh, over sin and death. He came to teach and fulfill this truth that established the kingdom of heaven, or reign or harmony on earth. The demonstration he made of this principle and truth of being is the strongest proof that God is the only intelligence that produces a perfect man, and is the life that is without death and holiness without sin. Only the science of being reveals the possibility of meeting the command, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven." The principle of man is perfect.
Okay, let's continue. Oh, somebody was here. Let's see. Oh, that woman came by. She said, "Where's Claire?" Claire doesn't want to talk to me on stream anymore since I started reading. Actually, since I started reading, most people don't want to watch my show. But you know what? All the nasty people are gone. I drove everyone away. You know, I don't get nasty, mean people coming here anymore. I get a few people that want to learn something serious, you know. Hold on. Okay, let's continue. True to his promise, Fry sent word to the reporter at the hotel that might interview Mrs. Eddy the next day. The world men themselves were fast developing a case of nerves. They had been in Concord for a few hours before they found some papers had disappeared from their room, and the night when they went for a walk, they were set upon by some thugs. The next afternoon, Fry sent for them with Mrs. Eddy's own carriage. At Pleasant View, they were set by Strang and were seated in the parlor where they were shortly joined. When Kent Strange buzzed in and out several times, then came in finally to say that Mrs. Eddy would receive them upstairs in her study. "Now follow me, if you please," said the urban String, leading the way. In a single file, they started to climb the stairs. Suddenly, Strang paused, raised his hand to order a halt. A dead silence hung over them. Not a sound could be heard in any part of the eerie house. Then, as Strang listened with uplifted ears, they all heard a woman's voice come down through the shadowy stairwell in a shrill whisper, "All right, be quick." "Quick now, please," Strange repeated, and they all hurried their pace into and rushed. Hastening through the hall into Mrs. Eddy's study, they lined up around the wall. They found themselves facing an aged woman who was standing in the center of the room, supporting her weight with her hands on a heavy table. Subsequently, events make it seem highly probable that they had arrived on one of Mrs. Eddy's worst days, and beyond a doubt, 1906 was one of her worst years. She had amazing recuperative faculties. Many times previously, she had risen from dire suffering to amazing displays of strength and energy, and she would again. But today she needed to exert every effort merely to stand erect before these intruders. She was woefully emaciated. Her hollow cheeks were bright with rouge. Her almost hairless brows were penciled a jet black and made a strange contrast with the whiteness of the hair. At her lean throat sparkled the diamond crown that had been Augustus Stetson's gift. She reeled as she stood there, a pitiful, appealing figure, trembling before the hunters who were upon her. Her eyes pleaded for mercy, her lips quivered, and yet her indomitable, proud spirit refused to let her yield. She raised her head, forced a sparkle into her eyes with an attempt at the surface vivacity which Mary Baker of old had once sought to win a hostile world. She tried to smile at the wondering Kent, whom she had not sent for 7 years. "My dear, dear professor," she faltered, how glad I am to see you. Let me congratulate you on getting back to your position. I am so glad that you are at the head of our schools again. She was trying to force her poor bewildered brain to remember. She paused, gathering herself, tried to smile at Kent once more. I cannot understand your interest in poor me, but I cannot be interviewed. It was a torture no less for her listeners than for her. Newspaper reporters are men paid to do difficult jobs, but it's distress that none the less sometimes to do the work. In a corner of the room, as they stood before her, they all could clearly see the galvanic battery that had been hastily pushed aside but not concealed, and a surgical basin half full of water with a sponge that was wet from usage. The room itself reeked with the pungency of ammonia. The whole interview lasted less than 3 minutes. As the man departed, Mrs. Eddy sank graspingly into the chair behind her, her frail body shaking with palsied spasms, and her face contorted in an agony of pain. Yes, said Kent as they went down the stairs, she is Mrs. Eddy beyond a doubt. The World did not publish the account of this interview until 2 weeks later. On October 28, 1906, meanwhile, the reporters remained in Concord using their eyes and their ears. They quickly discovered that Mrs. Eddy's carriage was emerging regularly for afternoon drives, following always the same route and leaving and returning always at the same hour. They were mystified. They were positive after their interview that Mrs. Eddy was wholly unable to leave her room. The carriage was closed. Fry always rode in uniform in the footman's box, which within sat a white-haired woman muffled to the ears in fur, always holding a small sunshade before her, despite the fact that her carriage was entirely enclosed and covered. Since the carriage moved at a rapid pace, and the woman within always adjusted the angle of her parasol so as to shield her face from observers, it was difficult to identify her. At that time, newspapers did not have the advantage of long-range cameras with the fast lens such as are in common use today, and the regular sorties of the carriage were puzzling. The problem of identifying the occupant, however, was shortly solved. The problem of identifying the occupant, however, was shortly solved. The World reporter finally found a man, one John J. Hennessy, who had known Mrs. Leonard well in the days when he was employed in the Temple Bar building in Brooklyn. Miss Leonard, Temple Bar building. Hold on. I want to see if that's anything. In Brooklyn, and when she was taking patients for $1 a treatment, he identified the carriage occupant as Mrs. Leonard without question. Less than a week after the World men had visited Concord, Mrs. Eddy sent a public denial of any invalidism to a Boston newspaper. This item was in letter form and read to the editor of the Boston Herald. Dear sir, another report that I am dead is widely credited. I am in usual good health and going out in my carriage every day. On Sunday, October 28th, the World broke forth with its story describing not only Mrs. Eddy's wretched physical condition, but also the attempts to conceal it by such maneuverings as Mrs. Leonard's rides in the Eddy carriage through the Concord streets. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Eddy's physical debility was not nearly as extreme as the World men imagined, for the reason that their view of her in one of her less buoyant moments left them without hint of the great recuperative powers that were hers. They had merely broken in upon her at an unfortunate time, but they could not know this, and so their paper openly charged that Mrs. Eddy had become merely the victim of designing clique who ruled her, body and soul, and that she was no longer the master either of her church or her fortune. It was intimate that she was either mentally irresponsible or actually insane. It was a sensational story, and within a few hours from the time it appeared, the Associated Press, the Publishers' Press, and various papers of prominence along the Atlantic seaboard had their own representatives in Concord. Once the World had picked up the scent, the pack forgot all their considerations in eagerness to join the chase. Mrs. Eddy was frightened, and her church officers were horrified. Alfred Farlow, Mrs. Eddy's publication committee in Boston, hurried to her home and summoned her. at her home and summoned there H. Cornell Wilson, who had been doing publicity work for Christian Science in New York City. Wilson, like so many others holding prominent positions in Mrs. Eddy's church, had never met her until called in this emergency and had seen her from a distance only once. Farlow himself had seen her only at rare intervals and took most of his orders from her by letter. He and Wilson both had reason to be surprised at the feebleness of Mrs. Eddy, who now met their gaze. As Farlow and Wilson hastily conferred with Fry and Strange, every train coming into Concord was bringing more newspaper men to gather upon Mrs. Eddy's front lawn. The whole situation was explained as tactfully as possible to Mrs. Eddy. As usual, in her periods of emergency, affidavits were decided upon. For a number of hours, her publication committee and his assistants worked at topmost speed. An importing list of deponents was secured. The names of men attesting to Mrs. Eddy's mental and physical fitness, including Gerald Frank S. Streeter, her attorney, who was later to be defending her sanity, J.E. Fernald, the president of the National State Capital Bank, Frederick N. Ladd, her cousin, who was treasurer of the Loan and Trustings Bank, Charles R. Corning, the mayor of Concord, and two Hampshire editors, M. Meehan and Concord Patriot, and George H. Moses of the Monitor and Statesman, subsequently of the United States Senate. Wow, a lot of, she was a lady who had a lot of friends in high places. These gentlemen were told that an emergency existed and were asked if they would do Mrs. Eddy the service of testifying that she was in good health and competent mind. Their reassuring and entirely optimistic affidavits were immediately sent abroad by telephone and telegraph over the country. For this time, the world's preliminary story concerning Mrs. Eddy in feebled condition was being copied in papers from coast to coast. The officials of Mrs. Eddy's church arose manfully from the first horror to exert superhuman efforts to protect their organization and its founder from these maledictions. All of the 50-odd publicity men scattered over the country began immediately to earn their salaries. On the Monday following the first Sunday story, 2 long-distance telephones were in constant commission between Boston and New York. Farlow sending the affidavits in the form to the taken down the New York via telephone and distributed there as well as in Boston. Farlow by this time had not only the position of chief publication committee, but also the office of president and mother church. A statement 2 columns long was given to the telegraph companies with instruction to send it free to any newspaper in the country desiring it, all tolls to be charged to the Christian Science officer. Simultaneously, all local publication committees were wired to put out a separate statement in their own localities. The newspaper men gathered in Concord, accepting the affidavits politely when they were proffered, but instead quite firmly that affidavits were not what they came to Concord to secure. They wanted to see Mrs. Eddy's constitutional ensued. It was finally decided that Mrs. Eddy would see the newspaper representatives at 1:00 on Tuesday, October 30th. Mrs. Eddy was quite certain that she could go through within such an interview. Her marvelous willpower, her dynamic determination were never more evident than any of the time when those around her had despaired of her ability to recuperate. There can be small doubt that her strange physical difficulties were unknown to those of her church officials to whom the news was most important. It is also probable that none of them was in any way aware of the bottomless mental complexes that lay concealed in her shadowy mind. Mr. Wilson, however, had a talk with her and decided on a program. It was obvious that she could not possibly stand the strain of anything more than a brief appearance, but it seemed possible to attempt a showing of the venerable woman under well-guarded auspices. Mrs. Eddy insisted that she was wholly able to go through with the ordeal. She was indeed confident that she could come downstairs and take a drive. This seemed a brilliant solution of the whole problem if it could be arranged in view of the world's assertions concerning Mrs. Leonard. If all the assembled reporters could actually see Mrs. Eddy mount into her vehicle, the vicious rumors ought permanently to be set at rest. It is perhaps difficult for one not imbued with the atmosphere that surrounded Mrs. Eddy and her church to sense the string of the world's exposure. It is particularly difficult when it is realized that Mrs. Eddy was not the helpless dupe of her household that the world had claimed. For even in her worst moments, Mrs. Eddy led everyone who came in contact with her a merry chase. It was her will that ruled. There was never a time when she wished to gain an end, when she failed to bring not merely her household, but also her board of directors cringing before her. Under such circumstances, it appears at first glance remarkably that her following should have been concerned over a story that denied her mental responsibility. It would seem that such a charge could have been easily disproved, but it could not have been disproved without showing Mrs. Eddy personally. And whatever her mental condition, she was at the moment a very sick woman physically, just as the world had said. The world's statement that she was suffering from cancer was a near diagnosis of her ailment as its reporters had been able to come. Now it happens that Mrs. Eddy was one person in the world who could never afford to make a public confession that she was sick. An admission of physical incapacity would jeopardize her no less than proof that she was actually insane, for she had built her whole life, her career, her fame, her fortune, her church upon claims that she had brought to the world a means of remission from suffering. To her disciples, she was the great deliverer. She had sought to establish the validity of her message on just one basis, its divine infallibility. The whole fabric of her life and church was now woven around that claim. And as always, when claims to divine infallibility are demonstrated to be fallacious, the validity of the entire structure which she had built upon this claim was now in danger. Okay, let's watch.
Let us then yield the belief that man is a separate intelligence from God, and reach his unerring principle of being, and be governed by life and love instead of matter. As music is harmoniously controlled by its principle, so man, governed by his principle of being, by soul and not sense, is harmonious, sinless, and immortal. The error of belief regarding soul and body and God and man introduces discord into the demonstration of man, even the sickness, sin, and death of which we complain. The idea of life is obtained only from its perfect principle and gained through science in which man is sinless and immortal. Sickness, sin, and death belong not more naturally to immortal man than to God, to body than to soul, for it is morally impossible that these should adhere to either. And what gave Jesus authority over sickness, sin, and death was the understanding of his scientific being. He stood boldly up in the face of all accredited evidence of personal sense, pharisaical creeds, etc., and refuted them all with his healing. We never read of his saying a creed or a prayer makes a Christian, or searching into disease to learn of discord. It wasn't acute or chronic, recommending laws of health, giving drugs, etc., or even asking the will of God regarding man's life. For this he already understood. He reckoned sickness, sin, and death liars from the beginning, and destroyed them with the truth of being that was self-evident to him, and his only physician. He kept the commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and we must do likewise and adapt this truth of being before we obtain its harmony or immortality. While Jesus rendered to Caesar the things that were Caesar's, he also rendered to God the things that were his, vis-a-vis truth, life, and love. And we too should acknowledge these God and sufficient to destroy every discord of man. Jesus paid no homage to diplomas, to forms of church worship, or the theories of man, but acted and spake as he moved by spirit, the principle of being. To the believing rabbi and Pharisee he said, "Even the publicans and harlots go into the kingdom of heaven before you." Not that he scoffed at Christianity, but he knew there is neither spirit, life, nor truth in mere forms of religion, and that a man can be baptized, partake of the sacrament, support the clergy, observe the Sabbath day, and make long prayers while yet a sensualist and hypocrite. Forms of personal worship may not be voluntarily wrong, but involuntarily so, inasmuch as they hinder the spirit. To be a hypocrite in the science of Christianity is morally impossible, for here Christianity is based on demonstration or proof, and yet many will come falsely in its name as predicted. When God is understood, man will need nothing besides God to make him healthy and harmonious. Jesus established his church on this very understanding, and taught his followers to cast out error and heal the sick. Instead of believing Christ a person, he said, Christ is truth and life, and I and the Father are one, thus claiming no separate intelligence, action, or life from God. And despite the persecution and crosses earned from the Pharisee, he wrought out on its principle harmonious being. The question was then as now at issue with mankind. How did Jesus, through Christ, his God being, heal the sick? Jesus answered this question in the explanation that the world rejects, when he appealed to his students, thinking they would better understand him, and asked, Whom do men say that I am? Referring to the eye that healed and cast out error, and they replied, Some say Elias, others Jeremiah, etc. But these men were dead. Therefore, their answer implied that some thought Jesus a medium controlled by the so-called spirits of the departed. We cannot doubt the belief of mediumship prevailed to some extent at that time, for Herod had been given the same definition of Christ's healing, saying, John the Baptist has come back, and therefore mighty works show forth themselves in him. That this wicked king and debauched husband should gain no higher interpretation of the science of being and the great work our master was not surprising. A sinner could not be supposed to comprehend this science if the disciples understood it not fully. They comprehended his spiritual explanations better than did others, but the connection they had with man's physical harmony or their application to heal the sick, they did not yet fully understand. So their master patiently persisted in teaching and demonstrating to them that the truth of being heal the sick, cast out error, and raise the dead. This science of life was not comprehended by his students until his final demonstration, when their great teacher stood before them the victor, not only over sickness and sin, but over death. In secret yearnings to be better understood, the Master turned in confidence to Peter, saying, But whom say ye that I am? This inquiry meant simply, who or what is it that casts out error and heals the sick? And because he turned from the other disciples' answer and put anew the question to Peter, it plainly indicated he disapproved the belief he was a medium, or that he was so bad before signified, saying, I and the Father are one. Peter's reply, so unlike the others, admitting he was Christ, truth that healed the sick and cast out error, called forth the answer, Our Father in heaven, that is the principle of man, hath shown thee this, in the science of being, and also that Jesus is the Son of God, the offspring of soul and not sense. On this principle and with this truth, he wrought all his so-called miracles. It was not man or medicine that healed the sick, but God, no matter that controlled man, but spirit that controlled matter. This, his interpretation of God and man, was the rock and foundation on which Jesus built his church, that is, established his demonstration of truth, God, against which the gates of errors could not prevail. But there was neither a creed nor right name to it, and mediumship plainly denied. To be Christ-like is to triumph over sickness, sin, and death, to open the prison doors to the captive, that is, to break the fetters of personal sense, and give to being fully scope and recompense. This is the ultimate of the command to love our neighbors as ourselves, and an idea from soul, yea, from wisdom, love, and truth. But this idea personal sense cannot see, feel, or understand, whereas spiritual sense can. The carnal mind cannot discern spiritual things. This idea is vague to personal sense, but to spiritual sense it is harmony. To favor his faults conciliates the man of error, but it prolongs discord. Belief produces all the errors of personal sense, and souls condemn them. Those hated by personal sense are loved of soul, and for the very things sense hates them. The foundation error that makes a mortal man is that personal sense is truth, the next that it is pleasure, the third that it is pain, but from this point dates its destruction. Hence the so-called pain of personal sense is comparatively encouraging, it being productive of less sin than its pleasure. But personal sense suffers only from imaginary selfhood. Its pleasure and pains are all unreal. The belief that matter has life and substance is the error that produces all suffering, sin, and death. The chemical action of truth on this error will destroy it. Truth gives the idea of spirit substance and destroys all supposed matter substance, while error gives the belief of matter substance and hides the idea of spirit substance. Immortal man is an idea of spirit substance, life and intelligence, but the mortal is a belief that intelligence, life, and substance are in matter. The idea of substance, guided by understanding, becomes the infinite idea, even as the soul of immortal man is the infinite principle. Mortal man is a belief of intelligence, substance, and life in the body, therefore of a limited infinite. To let oneself out of this nutshell, we must understand the scientific relationship between God and man, or principle and its idea. But before this is really understood, the interval will be filled with approaches to it through belief, and this will be attended with doubt, discord, and sin. The material world at a future date will become a spectacle of disorder and dismay on one hand, and of science on the other. There will be convulsions of mind and consequently of matter, spasms of air, earthquakes, famine, and pestilence. Sickness will become more acute and death more sudden. But to those who understand this hour, as explained in the science of being, length of days will increase, and harmony and immortality be near, even at the door. Knowledge will none diminish and lose estimate in the sight of man, and spirit instead of matter be made the basis of generation. At this period, phenomena will be spiritually discerned, but there will be strong conflicting opinions in result. Those understanding life scientifically will hold in check those letting go of old opinions who would hang on MD, a mesmerist, or a medium, thus curbing the violence of old beliefs, exercising retributive vengeance. The truly scientific will be a law to themselves of love, wisdom, and truth, and do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely. Sin will make deadly thrusts at the science of life as penal code goes out to give place to higher law. But those controlled by soul will spare the rod contrary to the religious persecution of past history, and save the erring from the gallows and gibbet. The martyrs will be the adherents to science in the coming centuries, and today their fate is foreshadowed. In coming years, the person or mind that hates his neighbor will have no need to traverse his field, to destroy his flocks and herds, and spoil his vines, or to enter his house to demoralize his household. For the evil mind will do this through mesmerism, and not in propria persona be seen committing the deed. Unless this terrible hour be met and restrained by science, mesmerism, that scourge of man, will leave nothing sacred when mind begins to act in a direction of conscious power. Sensuous man makes war to the death of his enemies, but the spiritual pours blessings on them unseen and unacknowledged, like the chamomile that crushed yields the sweetest odor. Spiritual minds emit an atmosphere of truth that blesses their enemies and destroys error while it is persecuting them. But stir the evil sensual mind, and worse than the deadly upas are the plagues it admits. Those who gain the essential points of the science of life will buffer from the sensual world more than even the primitive prophets and disciples did. But the science of being supports its followers amid shoals and quicksands. Spirituality is the only Christianity, and its basis is to be absent from the body and present with the Lord. Sensuality is personality ever present with the body. We have already sufficient professions of goodness without the spirit, too many religions, and not enough Christianity in the genius of the age. Man knows already too well how to make long prayers, to be heard for as much speaking, and to enlarge the pharisaical borders, to steal in private and to give in public. But this is political, not Christian economy. What we want is Christ and Him crucified. In other words, truth and the cross bearing that attends it to make mankind better. Because a man has uttered the law and 10 commandments to fashionable audiences some quarter of a century, it does not follow that he can demonstrate the Christianity of the prophets and of Jesus, who cast out error and healed the sick. Sometimes people resort to a cup of tea or coffee to help them preach, as if matter was superior to truth in this direction. Is the truth we utter matter or God? And if the latter, giving does not impoverish nor withholding enrich. Have we less of a spirit that is God for having given utterance to it, and is matter or spirit our strength? Because a man has obtained a high social and public position, are we to conclude he must be a good man? The soft palm upturned to a lordly salary and architectural power, making dome and spire tremulous with beauty, that turns the poor and stranger from the gate, shuts the door on Christianity. It is a skeleton of religion that requires a doctor of psychic to save the body, and a doctor of divinity to save what? Immortal soul that is already saved. This is not having Christ in you the hope of glory, nor does it cast out devils and heal the sick. The manger and cross tell in vain their story to pride and prejudice, taking wealth, popularity, and sensuality by the right hand, takes God by the left, and palsies at hand, making moral leopards instead of Christians. Here are Master's words on this subject. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. Ministers should make the pulpit the rostrum of truth, whipping creeds and prides out of their synagogues to let in humility and the science of God, using these strong arguments, cords that Jesus twisted together, to scourge out the synagogues, the money changers, and make them temples of truth. The prophet of today beholds in the spiritual horizon the bow of promise. The demonstration of Christianity that our Master gave is again required, and no other sign shall be given you. Christianity brings with it a phenomena that will be misinterpreted by the material age in which it appears, because it is the phenomena of soul and not matter, that personal sense cannot comprehend, but when spiritually discerned will be found to destroy sickness, sin, and death. Creeds, doctrines, and belief do not express it, much less can they demonstrate it. We must understand God to demonstrate truth. Jesus of Nazareth, the fittest teacher of mankind, possessed this understanding, but the scorning rabbi, the rival Pharisee, Gethsemane, and the cross were ready to devour him. Over 18 centuries ago, the mere religionist was willing to hail Christ, truth, with pomp and scepter, but it came not thus, and though the modern scourge is a scoff, instead of the lash, the doors of some churches are quite as effectually closed against Christ today as then. Truth bids man watch, but is there guard or control held over personal sense by mere religionists? The Christianity of Jesus was the science of being. It destroyed sickness, sin, and death, denied personal sense, bore the cross, and reached the right hand of God, even the perfect principle of man. Our Master, meekly and yet as a victor, bore the mockery of his self-conscious God being. He maketh himself as God, was the foundation of all accusations against him, and the indignities he met. His followers must now meet until this truth is understood. He overcame the world, temptation, and sins, proving their nothingness. He wrought through the science of being, the example of salvation from sin, sickness, and death, and established the proof that he was Christ, and that Christ is God and soul and life of man. Every good word and work of our Master evoked but denial, ingratitude, and persecution from sensualism and malice. Of the 10 lepers he healed, but one returned to give thanks. That is, to acknowledge the principle that healed him. Therefore, but one interpreted his healing aright, and yet he wrought on his enemies. He felt their sicknesses, but more he felt their sins, despised and rejected of men, yet returning blessing for cursing. His spirituality must destroy the materiality, and through his stripes must they be healed, because error had felt the blow truth gave it. The scourge and cross awaited Jesus. The man of sorrows was not in danger from salaries or popularity, deserving the homage of the world, and sharing preeminently the approval of the soul. Brief was his triumphant journey into Jerusalem, and followed by his desertion of all save a few mourners at the cross. This is what it means to be spiritual in an age of materiality. The impossibility for worldly favor to attend Christianity is seen in its great moral distance from it. When personal sense approves, soul condemns, and where man praises, God receives no thanks. One of the evidence of materialism and error is when the belief in life and matter is full of worldly prosperity. History informs us that Jesus, feeling the gross materialism that surrounded him, at times experienced a momentary weakness and turning asked, "Who hath touched me?" The more material thought this inquiry was occasioned by contact with his body, but he knew it was mind in the multitude that called on him for aid to destroy its belief and make it more spiritual even as himself. His quick apprehension of this arose from his spirituality and their misconception from their materiality. Not that he deserved less the advantage of adroitness because of his goodness, but possessing the insight and honor that cometh from soul, only he had less personal sense. These two come from opposite directions, and the treasure of our Master were laid up in spirit, not matter. Christianity turns from sense to soul as naturally as the flower turns from darkness to light. Those things eye hath not seen or ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive, belong to it. Paul and the loving John had a very clear sense of the science of being. They knew a man achieves not worldly honors except he labors for them, and lays a sacrifice upon the altar of mammon, by giving his affection to the world. And they also knew to make this offering to wealth or fame was not to leave all for Christ, truth that comes from the opposite direction, and from opposite means and aims. Also that a man walks in the directions he is looking, and that where his treasure is, there his heart also. If our hopes are spiritual, we are not looking or yearning for the material, but will wear the image and likeness of God at any worldly cost. In reality, we are coming out from the world of sense and being separated from it. The favor of sectarianism, the homage of wealth and smiles of ambition flee before Christianity, but wisdom crowns its brow. If my friends are going to Europe and I am making my way to California, we are no longer journeying together, but have separate time boards to consult and different routes to pursue. In fine, our paths have parted, and we have no interest in common to help each other on in opposite directions. But if they will pursue my course, I will give them my railroad guide and interest myself to make their passage pleasant. Or it will take theirs, they will help me on, and our companionship will continue. Thus the scientist must choose his course and be honest. Acting consistent with that choice, his route lies not with the world of sense. And if he gravitates thitherward, he is like a man who travels one day east and another west. But thinking the passage west a more fashionable route, the company more alluring, and its pleasures more enticing, changes tactics and journeys 6 days westerly and 7th day towards the east, vehemently protesting he is traveling one direction only. You would say of that man that he is untrue and cannot be trusted, and don't let him cajole you into the belief that he is really going east because he produces from his pocket a ticket earned by some toil-worn pilgrim who had explored the way and from whom he begged it, and with this passport means to make his passage. Unless a man advances spiritually, he is not scientific, and if he is scientific, he must start honestly and journey some every day. And however long he is reaching the desired goal, if his honesty be preserved, he will finish his course. Many starting with the letter of science will omit the spirit and make shipwreck of the course.
Okay, let's finish the reading. The same thing has happened time and time again in other churches to other religious leaders who have erred in the same way. When any message is preached to men that make its major claim to virtue the assertion that it is divine in origin and hence infallible in operation, it bears the position its own eventual destruction in its breath. Thus, in her old age, the fragment of human aspiration and imagination from which Mary Baker Eddy had built a lofty dream castle to soar into the clouds began crashing down around her. She who had claimed the infallibility to heal all who knocked at her door must now humbly admit that she could not heal herself. She who had brought man that she was appointed of God to bring them the golden key that would unlock all divine good must now bow her head to confess that she herself could not use the key. Yet her pride burned within her. This should stand to her glory. Tortured as she was, she refused to recant, which all her pretensions now challenged. She raised her head, reared herself to her feet. Even as the reporters hung in throngs around her door, she steadied herself and looked Wilson in the eye. "I will see them," she said. And thus it was that she nerved herself for her ordeal and called for her women to bring her finest clothes and was bathed and rubbed and prepared. Once again, emergency gave her strength. All her life threatened disaster and acted like a springboard for her energies. Once, when she was still Miss Patterson, sick in bed in the shabby little house in North Groton, she heard cries of terror out in the side lot. Dr. Patterson was there chopping wood. Then, when a neighbor farmer had come in with his son and started an argument, most probably over one of doctor's unpaid bills. The argument developed in blows. The doctor fell to the ground, and the enraged farmer motioned to his son to take the axe and end the dispute with a murder. At this juncture, Mr. Patterson rushed from the house. At this junction, Miss Patterson rushed from the house with an unnatural strength in her arms and an unwanted callousness to fear. She seized the farmer's son with his uplifted axe, overpowered him, held him until neighbors came running in answer to her shriek. Now in her old age, it was the same. Mary Baker, who once again saw disaster looming, this time it was not a husband who was endangered, it was herself and her child. The church to which she had given her very life. Wilson conferred with the newspaper man at their hotel. We have decided, she purred, to let you see Mrs. Eddy. Certain things must be arranged now and clearly understood. Of course, it would be impossible to address a lot of questions to Mrs. Eddy. It would not be proper, you know. Now it will be best to select one of your numbers to ask certain questions, which would be prepared in advance. I suggest S.W. O'Brien, who represents Widgways Weekly. This lady interviewed Mrs. Eddy several years ago and will be proper one of the questions today. The newspaper men did not at that time know that Mrs. Sybil Werber O'Brien was at that very moment engaged in completing a biography of Mrs. Eddy, that she had previously spent a great deal of time with Mrs. Eddy in conference regarding her material, and that she was being financed during her undertaking by one of the members of Mrs. Eddy's board of directors. Had they known, they might possibly have objected, and Mrs. Eddy's ordeal would have been made still more difficult. But it was agreed that Mrs. O'Brien should be the official spokesperson, and she and Mr. Wilson prepared 3 questions which were to be asked. The list of queries they devised were as follows: Are you in perfect health? Have you any physical physician other than God? Do you have a drive daily? This list was read aloud to the assembled reporters. Is that all? Is that all? Inquired A.J. Vivian of the New York Times. Why, yes, said Mr. Wilson amiably. Those 3 questions seem to cover every point. It does not strike me that way at all, said Vivens. If you had read the published statements in New York World, you must know that the property interest of Mrs. Eddy forms a vital important point. Who is handling her money? The other reporters chimed in with agreement with Vivian. Finally, Wilson yielded to their insistence that a 4th question be added to the list. It was phrased to read, does any besides yourself administer your property or attend to your business affairs? When the question was finally outlined, Wilson informed the men that the reporter for the New York World would be excluded. Wilson could not forgive either that newspaper or its representatives. 9 reporters, among whom Vivian of the Times was the only New York representative, left the hotel as exactly 20 minutes to go, riding in 3 carriages. They reached Pleasant View to be met at the door by Strange, who bowed them into Mrs. Eddy's rose and gilt-drawn room, lifting heavy priorities to allow them to pass. And they passed. The portieres were allowed to fall again, completely obscuring the view of the hall and the stairways. Mrs. Leonard and Mrs. Sargent shortly came into the room, richly and superbly gowned. They introduced themselves, welcomed the guests with a show of graciousness, and went away. Through the window, the men held the well-known Eddy coach driving up to the door. Shortly, the portieres were thrusted aside, and a man in a dark green livery of a footman stepped into the room, holding a top hat in his pudgy white hand. Someone whispered Fry in an audible voice. Fry heard, his plump cheeks flushed, and he turned away and vanished again through the curtains. There was a long pause. The men settled into an uncomfortable silence, and then, without a sound, without a warning step or single preliminary indication, the great portieres were drawn to either side by hands that were not visible, and framed between them, the men saw Mrs. Eddy standing just beyond the doorway. There she remained motionless for a moment, haggard, emaciated, and palsied, her cheeks tinted brightly with rouge, her gleaming, deep-sunken eyes roaming around as if to seek a familiar object. She was dressed in brave extravagance, in finery reminiscent of nothing more than a marchioness in one of her girlhood's favorite Southworth novels, powdered, bewigged, and bejeweled, fluttering with ribbons and plumes. She would have attracted stares anywhere. She was at heart still the Mary Baker Glover who all her life had sought to impress a difficult world with ill-chosen nuances of costume that could make her nothing less than remarkable and conspicuous. But today she wore an ermine cloak instead of the beribboned world dress of learner years. It was the cloak given to her by Augustus Stetson. It parted at her shoulder to reveal a rosen silk gown at her throat, where her diamonds, or her head a hat knotted large white ostrich plumes. She took 2 steps forward to the portieres, and her groveled hand shook with palsy even as she reached them out to grasp the draperies and steady herself. Fry appeared at her right, Strange at her left, moving out from the portieres
and they had previously drawn apart from the concerning motion and which had until now concealed them. They stood there alert, all ready to support her if she should sway. Once again, Mrs. Eddy had been caught by intruders in an interim when the tide of her amazing vitality was at an ebb. To make matters worse, she was undoubtedly nervous and faint with the tremulousness of fear. But as the portieres parted, she stood revealed to the tense faces before her. She tried to smile, and smile died, and she hesitated like a very old lady who had been told to expect something, but has forgotten just what and is trying to collect her mind. She mumbled a quiet, inaudible sentence and turned away as if to go to the front door. Edward M. Patterson, Secretary of State for New Hampshire, was in the room with the newspaper men with an announced purpose of identifying Mrs. Eddy for her interviewers. He had known the old lady for a number of years. As Mrs. Eddy stood wavering at the door, he sought to catch her eye. "How do you do, Mrs. Eddy?" he ventured politely. She did not notice or hear him, gave no sign of recognition. Among her other ailments, Mrs. Eddy was contended with deafness, and this moment Mrs. O'Brien stepped forward, and the men behind her closed in. She caught Mrs. Eddy's attention, but the old lady gazed at her without recognition. "Are you in perfect bodily health, Mrs. Eddy?" asked Mrs. O'Brien deferentially. There was a quick and very perceptible change in Mrs. Eddy's manner. She caught herself, came back to a step, and hesitantly leaned against the doorway. "What?" she inquired in her aged treble. Mrs. O'Brien hastily repeated the question. Yes, indeed I am," she murmured quite indistinctly. "Have you any physician other than God?" Again, Mrs. Eddy's questioning gaze wandered pitifully over the faces of her audience. "What?" she replied. Mrs. O'Brien repeated the second question, this time in a loud voice. Mrs. Eddy raised her head as if taking a cue, then loosened her hold on the portieres and flung out her arms. "No," she recited in a voice high-pitched and without accent. "No, his everlasting arms are around me." Here she half turned away backward, and Fry hastily steadied her with an extended arm. Mrs. O'Brien pressed forward. For Mrs. Eddy's own sake, she had a duty to complete. "Do you take a drive daily, Mrs. Eddy?" By this time, Mrs. Eddy was staggering away from the drawing room door, half supported by Fry and Strange. Advancing still further, Mrs. O'Brien repeated her question more loudly. Do you take a drive daily, Mrs. Eddy?" Yes, answered Mrs. Eddy brokenly. She was already turned away, her momentary strength gone, the 90-odd pounds of her slight body almost a dead weight on the two men who were seeking to assist her in such a manner that their support would not seem obvious. As Mrs. O'Brien asked her last question, "Does anyone besides yourself administer your property?" Mrs. Eddy was already down the hall. She did not hear. Half leading, half carrying, Fry and Strange got her to the doorway. A reporter rushed forward to walk beside her and gazed closely into her face. He was pulled roughly back by one of the men in the household, Herman S. Herring, the first reader in the Concord Church. For a moment, as the reporters watched, Mrs. Eddy sought to shake off the hands that supported her. She tried bravely under the skeptical stares to walk along down the few steps that led to the carriage, waiting under the porte-cochere, but her knees sank under her at the third step, and Fry put his arm around her. He and Strange lifted her fragile frame almost bodily into the coach. Strange wrapped rugs around her, placed a stool beneath her feet, tucked her carefully in. She reached for one of the ribbons that hung from her throat. Her palsied hands could not grasp it. She let the hand fall, and her fingers began drumming ceaselessly on the rugged tucked across her lap. Looking up again, she motioned with shaking arms to have the carriage door closed. She stuck her hands in her muff, set herself primly in response, gazed straight ahead, tried pathetically to compress her trembling lips into a straight line. Fry mounted his box, and Coach Line signaled the fat and sleepy horses to pick up their hooves. Okay, let's continue with the...
We must not only seek, but strive, or we cannot enter the narrow path of science. For broad is the opposite one of sense that leadeth to destruction, and many go in thereat. Jesus experienced few of the so-called pleasures of personal sense. Perhaps she knew its pain, for he bore our infirmities, that through his stripes he might be healed. Truth in contact with air produced chemicalization. Hence, our Master's suffering came through contact with sinners, but Christ, the soul of man, never suffered. Jesus mapped out the path of science of being, and through poverty of sense was enriched by soul. But to those buried in the belief of life and matter, and insisting that we see alone with eye, and hear with ears, and feel through nerves, he said, having eyes ye see not, and ears ye hear not, that ye might understand and be converted, and I might heal you. Their belief of personal sense shut out the communication of soul, hence the saying, ye cannot serve two masters. Jesus adhered to one only, was guided by spiritual sense, therefore the sensualism of the age separated from him and hated him. His affections were pure, theirs carnal. His senses were truth, theirs but error. Therefore love with him was spiritual science. With them it was material sense. Their imperfection and impurity felt his perfection and purity in ever-present rebuke. Hence the world's hatred of the just and more spiritual Jesus, and the prophet's foresight of the reception it would give him. The people knew not how to interpret their uncomfortableness arising from his presence with them, and the chemical changes he instituted in their being. When those opposites met, had they understood the meaning of the stir it produced, they would, like Peter, have wept at the warning, and begun a warfare with personal sense that opposed truth. They, in their ignorance of the science of life, never regarded the fact that the good are hated only by the evil, while the former suffer for the latter in lifelong sacrifice. He bore their sins in his own person, that is, he felt the suffering their error brought, and through his consciousness destroyed error. Had the Master utterly conquered the belief in life and mattered, he would not have felt their infirmities. He had not yet risen to this final demonstration, or had he partaken equally of their sensuous being, he would not have so suffered for them, nor they from him. By overcoming his own temptations, he had measurably conquered them even while they knew it not. He demonstrated purity and truth and their power to heal the sick, and assured others they might give his demonstration, but for their disbelief in its science. Though they saw not his righteousness, they must all gain the harmony of being from the truth he taught, and plant their demonstration on the foundations he laid. On what he experienced for them and poured liberally into their ears, this was the cup drank by the pioneer of the science of life, by him who came with those higher proofs and practices of truth and love, unperceived by the age in which they appeared. They neither understood him nor his works, and would not accept his explanation, who did not understand them. Anomalous though it seems, I have no doubt that Jesus was shunned and deemed a bad man at the period of his public labors by all, save the few unpretentious ones whose Christianity enabled them to understand him. This was the cup drank to the dregs by our Master. He also spake of those who followed him, drinking this very cup, which must indeed be the case if they are in advance of the public sentiment. Referring to himself as doing nothing beyond the ability of others to do, he said, "The works I do, ye shall do, and greater." Before this, he had established the platform that a tree is known by its fruit, indicating if they heal the sick on the principle that he healed, they must be Christians. Though it is in vain we stretch our weary wings to the full realization of that saying today, yet in centuries to come I look for its fulfillment. Whosoever shall triumph over personal sense and lay down his earthly all on the altar of the science of being will drink his cup and be able to give the demonstration of healing the sick, casting out error, raising the dead, and triumphing over the grave that our blessed Master gave for an example. But earth hath no recompense for such a life. Personal sense can neither give nor receive this reward. The understanding of God is its only recompense that lifts being above mortal discord and gives it immortal harmony. A person may reward unjustly, but principle cannot. That we receive all deserved punishment on earth is quite as false as that all our rewards are mundane. And who that toils and sacrifices unceasingly bears the cross only to see their existence mocked, will say this is sufficient from the hand of love. Or again, that those who have suffered all they have to experience will still gloating in sensuality and hypocrisy or murder and rapine, succeeding in all villainies up to the time they pass suddenly from sight in this loathsomeness, are pardoned and pushed straight into glory. Their punishment here was certainly insufficient to reform them, which is the design of wisdom, and the good man's heaven would be to them a hell. How can they find bliss in purity and truth, to whom these are the very opposite themselves? There is nothing in mercy or love that can pardon the necessity in science for sinners to suffer after death. To destroy the penalty due to sin would be for truth to pardon error, in which case the sinner is no wiser for what he's experienced. For if he escapes the punishment he deserves, it is not according to God's government, in which justice is the handmaid of mercy. For sin, to produce suffering, is the only way to destroy it to him who believes in the pleasures of sin. When man admits there is no pleasure in sin, he has begun to save himself. Contemplating history from every moral data down to the present, we learn the faith in Christ, truth that caused our martyrs to be burned and the rights of man to be christened on the gallows, repeats itself in the just suffering from the unjust. Then how was God pardoned sin? We all suffer because of sin and must until science destroys sin and suffering. Did the martyrdom of John Brown make one of the crimes of Jefferson Davis less, or less deserving its reward? What awaits the God-inspired martyr is the crown of thorns here and the victor's palm hereafter. But what awaits the pampered hypocrite is the laurel here and the thorns there. This demonstration Jesus gave of God did for the world more than a problem wrought and explained in mathematics does for the learner. It taught the human race how to demonstrate aright the principle that is God, and if this demonstration had been understood, man would have reached the example of Jesus and solved this being harmoniously ere this. The martyr's spirit is the stepping stone from the human to the divine. Martyrs are the luminaries of soul that go down to personal sense. Like the sun to appear again in the amplitude of their being, when sensuality shall give place to spirituality and the leader's standpoint is reached. Truth is self-conscious, right that brings its own reward, but not amid the smoke of battle is it seen or appreciated. The personal belief of God that holds spirit person instead of principle, making soul intelligent matter, and possessing all the tyranny and passionate belief of life in matter manifest, was the very error that crucified Jesus, and that today is shutting out the reign of harmony. Jesus knew there was but one God, hence that man's intelligence was God and not man, principle and not person. Therefore said he, I and the Father are one. And because of this scientific statement and the demonstration it brought with it, the rulers cried out, Crucify him, he maketh himself as God. And what further witness need we against him? Today this very statement is met with the same opposition from sensualism it ever was. And why? Because it cuts off right hands and plucks out eyes by denying personal sense and lays the axe at the root of the tree, cutting off the medium of all sin. God is perfect, and if there be no other intelligence, we can have no imperfection. The only way to destroy error is to divest it of supposed intelligence by which it can give pain or pleasure. Now to admit there is separate intelligence from good, called evil, is the error that admits two powers, namely God and devil, simultaneous, but gives superiority and all worldly success to the latter. This error is waning somewhat, and today his satanic majesty is not deemed so much a distinct individual as a universal power. The next step in progress is to learn that there is no devil, that error and sin have no intelligence. The scriptures deny aught but God and his creation, and assert there was nothing made without him. While out of the mouth of Most High proceedeth not good and evil, in other words, that God never made a demon, for a pure fountain sends forth corrupt streams, and nothing but God is self-existence. Jesus stripped all disguise from his error, had he only been understood. He explained it impossible to have another intelligence than God, or for him to create evil, and demonstrated this by healing the sick and casting out devils, showing that God destroyed Satan instead of making it. In other words, that truth destroys error by proving its nothingness. The personal belief that man is a separate mind from God, and that this mind comprehends, feels, and exists, an entity within the cranium, and sins and suffers, ad libitum, is the only personal devil there is, and the one we should begin to cast out. This error is not the result of brains, but it is a belief that brains are intelligence. In other words, that God is in matter. It is not the result of intelligence in matter, but a belief that matter is intelligent, not the product of man's mind, but a belief there is mind in man. And this belief is delusion, and delusion error. Do you ask who or what is it that believes? inasmuch as you admit God is not the author of error, and that all things were made by him, and without him nothing was made. We answer, no one believes. It is only that error is a belief, and a belief is error. The prerogative of soul is understanding, but personal sense has no claim whatever to this. We need not cite anatomy, physiology, materia medica, etc., that place intelligence in personal man, but will cover the ground with the scripture metaphor that named belief the tree of knowledge, whence sprang sickness, sin, and death. A belief is not intelligence, nor its result, neither God, nor the result of this principle. It is not soul, nor its manifestation. What then is it? The opposite of soul, called brains and personal sense. Error is the opposite of intelligence and imitates it only by falsehood, calling principle, person, God, man, thus presupposing man intelligent matter. Is it an error to believe truth? It is impossible to do this. All we receive of truth comes through the understanding. The so-called mind of man can be deranged or destroyed by a blow on the cranium, but intelligence that governs man and the universe is not lost. Intelligence is life, love, and truth, and by no means personal sense, sin, sickness, and death. The mind of intelligence understands and never believes, and the body of intelligence is spiritual, not material, idea, and not substance. Yea, it is like the reflex shadow of a soul. Even man, that is the image and likeness of God. What besides this we name man is but a belief in error, dust to dust. Hereby we learn a lie in all that Satan there is, and marking its footsteps we gain this proof: all the discord on earth proceed from false conception of God and man. Besides, falsehood preys on harmony in society and hides individual character. Truth is generally unperceived, because a lie is a more natural conclusion for the wicked. Expose sin, and it turns a lie on you. A sinner for the time prospers in secret wrongdoing until the final hour that whatsoever is hidden shall be revealed. We must tell the truth concerning sin and sinners, because of the moral necessity not to cover iniquity, that they will deny what we say, of course, but at the same time it produces the desired effect, and we receive our reward, for it introduces new light and makes sinners afraid to repeat the offense when they found out. The higher you rise in the scale of truth, the more intense and multiplied are the lies concerning you. The louder God speaks, the higher the devil lifts his voice to be heard above him. The more truth you bring, the more error is stirred by it, until the final conquest on the side of right. Jesus taught his students the science he understood, but they never reached his demonstration, and rose toward it only as they followed implicitly his directions. It is of little importance whether self-abnegation and faithfulness are rewarded in the present or future. Their recompense is sure. There must be a going out of personal sense and coming in of the spiritual to understand the sense of being, and to give a higher sense of omnipotence whereby to control man and matter. Jesus taught in practice the science of being, tested the reception it would meet before it was understood, and notwithstanding the malice that error aimed at truth, fulfilled his sole mission, triumphed over sense, and sat down at the right hand of the Father, having solved being on its principle, which is truth, life, and love. He who was God and not in man was no respecter of persons, therefore claimed no personal worship. Persecuted from city to city, he went about doing good, for which he was maligned and stoned. Jesus taught us principle is God and God is love, but Pharisee and priest affirmed God is person that can love and hate. Truth that is felt is hated by the sinner, for it cuts off right hands, plucks out the eyes, and calls on him to become wise. The belief of God in matter or the personal deity never yet made a Christian, and will go down in a moral chemical that has already begun arid, will continue until God has admitted soul outside of sense and the only intelligence. The basis of all health, sinlessness, and immortality is the one great truth, that God is the only intelligence, and for this truth the great teacher of the science of life was martyred. The reward of our master was not on earth.
Switch now to Fios 2 gig, our fastest internet ever.
Look, I finally cut the cable, switched to Fios 2 gig.
Upload speed's 20 times faster than cable.
On the 100% fiber optic network.
Oh?
Hey, cut it out!
Switch to Verizon.
earth, and not in matter but spirit, while all his sufferings came from the materiality of the age, and were not because of his own sins, but the sins of others. Then was it just for him to suffer? No, but it was inevitable in this wicked world where the good suffer because of the evil, even as the evil derive blessings from the good. Jesus taught us that the way of truth is the way of salvation, which is spiritual. Material religion consists of rites, ceremonies, a personal God, etc., but this is not Christianity. 70 students Jesus sent forth, whom he had faithfully taught. But of 12 only have we a special record, and one of those had a devil. His final crucifixion drew near, the hour of triumph over personal sense, and all the pangs this world could occasion the bore that gave the highest proof of the science of being, proof so important to mankind. Judas thought to take advantage of the world's ingratitude to his teacher, and betray him into the hands of his enemies for 30 pieces and the smile of a Pharisee. Well did the pitiful traitor know his time, for the world was then in mystery concerning him and his teaching. Perhaps Judas feared the period approached that should reveal the great goodness which enabled his master to demonstrate above him, and to rebuke the sinner as none other could. The moral distance between himself and his teacher had already created his enmity, wherein greed for gold had held empire over gratitude. He also knew the sensuous world loved a Judas better than it did a Jesus, and this was another point through which to victimize his teacher, and raise himself with the people. Judas had all the world's weapons, Jesus none of them. Therefore he chose not to defend himself before those who understood not that defense, so he opened not his mouth. The great exponent of truth and love, silent before error and hate. They to whom he had given the highest proofs of the science of being misinterpreted them and said deridingly, "He maketh himself as God." Those who turn aside the right of a man before the face of the Most High esteemed him, stricken and smitten of God. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep dumb before his shearers. And who should declare his generation? Who in the future should say, "Whence cometh truth?" and answer the question, "What is truth?" The rabbis could not decide this momentous inquiry. They must wait on the centuries. But the woman at the cross, Clued, say he was right, who had inspired their devotion, winged their faith with understanding, healed the sick, cast out error, and caused those he sent forth to say, "Even devils are subject to us through thy name." But where were the 70 whom he had taught? Were all conspirators save 11? Had they forgotten his weary years of explanation and patient waiting, all the labors of love as the clay of the day he taught them the science of life, and spake to them the truth of man? Could they not give him even a cup of cold water in its name, and satisfy for a moment his yearning for one proof of their fidelity to what he had taught? From early boyhood he had been about his master's business, and they about theirs. But their masters were unlike. One was spirit and the other matter. One God, the other man. One was soul, the other personal sense. He had suffered and experienced for them, to give liberally his dear-bought bounty under their famine. But what was his reward? Forsaken of all save a loving few, who knelt in woe at the scene of his crucifixion. Peter would have smitten the enemies of his master, but he bade him put the sword, and take not the world's weapons to defend truth. Jesus, disdaining artifice or brute courage, when truth could not protect him from the false accusations, was able to submit to a felon's death. His mission was to vindicate a principle and not a person, while their highest ambition was the applause of man. Jesus could have no doubt withdrawn from his enemies, but he permitted them the opportunity to destroy his body mortal, that he might furnish the proof of his immortal body in corroboration of what he had taught, that the life of man was God, and that body and soul are inseparable. The opposite belief was that error he came to destroy. Neither spear nor cross would harm him. Let them think to kill the body, and after this he would convince those he had taught this science he was not dead, and possessed the same body as before. Why his disciples saw him after the burial, when others saw him not, was because they understood better his explanation of this phenomena. He had given them the principle of it, in healing the sick, hence the unsatisfied malignancy of his foes, that he was not dead, but furnished a higher demonstration than ever of the principle he taught, and for which they had hoped to kill him. Another important feature was that he sought not the protection of law from their unjust wrath, but chose in every instant to demonstrate the higher law that governed being, that cast out error, healed the sick, and was about to prove its triumph over death, over the beliefs of personal sense in life and substance and matter. Jesus knew the body is but a reflex shadow of immortal soul, also that it is impossible to lose this, for as the scriptures say,
All right, that's it, guys. Thanks for coming. See you tomorrow.